Hi everyone, it's Ben, and I'm here today to talk to you about how to set up your Deluxe Reverb amp for use at home at lower volumes. Now, this is just a standard Deluxe Reverb reissue amp that I've had for about 10 years, and one of the things that you probably know if you have a medium-sized tube amp or larger is that getting it to sound good at a low volume at home is difficult, and if you have a Deluxe Reverb, you probably know it's even a little harder if all you do is just turn the volume down to somewhere between 1 and 2 to get it sort of at quieter volumes that are acceptable if, say, someone else in the house is working or asleep, or if you live in an apartment or you're trying to practice late at night. So I've got a few tips and tricks for how to deal with some of the quirks of this amp for practicing at home. All right, let's start out. Just off the bat, a lot of the things people turn to first with a loud tube amplifier that they want to play quietly at home is with some kind of attenuator, which is a device that goes in between the amp and the speaker and essentially soaks up volume by being a big resistor that eats power and dissipates it in the form of heat. Now, I don't recommend using a power attenuator on this kind of amp because one of the great things about this amp is that it sounds good clean, and a power attenuator, while it can get you up into the volumes that the amp will break up at, I think, generally speaking, just changes the character, both of the sound and how it feels to play too much. And that's because the way a power attenuator works is it sits in between the amp and the speaker, and it kind of severs that relationship that is really one of the beautiful things about tube amps, which is that the output transformer on the amp interacts with the speaker, where at different volumes, at different frequencies, the speaker is actually presenting a different kind of load at different times. Now, a reactive load attenuator will attempt to emulate that, but in my opinion, it just generally doesn't sound that good. Now, what are you going to do? So one of the things that I've done, and this is money you would spend, is I've replaced the speaker in this amplifier, which is a Jensen reissue that it comes with an Eminence Maverick speaker. And what's special about that speaker is that it has a dial on the back that pulls the magnet away from the voice coils in one direction and pushes it forward in the other. And when it's forward, it's at full volume and sounds pretty much exactly like the Jensen reissue. And when you dial it the other direction, it pulls it away. There's less energy transferred to the speaker coil, and that actually can knock about 10 decibels of volume off. And 10 decibels may not sound that much, but remember that decibels are a log scale, which means every 3 decibels you knock off is half the volume. And by the 10, it's a little less than 1/8 of the volume. But that said, that's still not going to get you into bedroom level territory. So let's just demonstrate that. So what I've done here is I've already set up the amp at kind of an EQ setting I like, at a volume I like, and you'll hear it's still pretty loud. So this is... Sorry, I still had one of my pedals on. So you can see that peaked at 109 on the decibel scale, which is really too loud. And if I dial this dial back, pulling the speaker out, it should quiet down quite a bit. Peaking around 100, 101 there. So that there is 1/8 the volume already. But it's still loud. It's still louder than I'd like to. I can't speak over it, for example, even if I speak loudly. So here's what I recommend you do to get this even quieter. At that volume, which is at 3, it's not even breaking up yet. If I go to 4, it will. That's kind of the range I like it. And the reason that is the range I like it, in kind of 3, 4, maybe 5, is not just the breakup, but the actual EQ is different when you have the volume at different levels. And that's because on this vibrato channel, which is also sometimes called the bright channel, unlike the normal channel, which doesn't have the reverb and the tremolo on it, there is something going on with this volume control. And that is something called a bright cap. And a bright cap is essentially, you have your signal going through the volume, and the volume chokes it down when it's off, but there's a second path around the volume knob where they put a capacitor in that only allows high frequency signals through. And what that means is no matter what you've got the volume set to, there are treble or high frequency signals are going to pass by that volume knob without being affected by it at all. And so what that means is if you've got the volume down to like 1 to 2, which is really kind of more the speaking range, depending on the taper of your pot there's still all that treble going through, and it's very bright, very ice picky, doesn't sound great at that volume. So you've got that to contend with beyond just trying to get the amp in a place where the tubes are working. And so the way I recommend dealing with that is don't turn the volume knob down. Now, when you're doing that, you can turn the volume down further without engaging the bright cap on your guitar. But the problem with turning the volume down on your guitar, and you probably notice this especially on single coil guitars, is it rolls off a lot more of the highs than the lows when you do that. And the reason that the highs are affected, and actually really the whole tonal character of the guitar, which sometimes you want, but sometimes you might not want, is because these pickups are passive pickups. That means just the strings vibrating in front of them is what generates the electricity, and that interacts with anything in the signal chain between that and the first amplification stage you hit. So if you just got a cord between the guitar and the amplifier, that means up until the amp, anything in between there, like a crummy cable, a really long cable, a curly cable, turning down your volume knob, is going to have a big impact on how your pickups react. The reason the volume knob in your amp doesn't interact with the pickups like that is because the first thing your amp hits is actually that first tube before it hits the volume knob, at least on a decent, any modern amp. Some of the early amps that never became popular, and you won't find a lot these days, actually would have a volume knob just like on your guitar before it hit an amplification. So the first tube amplifies the volume. This volume knob reduces that volume before any of the other stages of your amplifier. So the trick to handling that, if you want to have some volume that gets knocked down but doesn't affect your pickups, is something like this volume pedal I've got here. So this is actually just exactly the same kind of thing. My foot is controlling a potentiometer just like the volume knob in my guitar, but the trick is I have it after my pedal board. And that is important because on this pedal board, I have several what are called buffers on the board. So there's one in the Klon, and I think there's another one in most Boss pedals, so I'm guessing this Dimension C chorus has it as well. And you've probably heard of buffered versus true bypass and how a lot of people want true bypass. And that's true because you don't want a buffer where you don't want it. But when you do want a buffer, it's super helpful. So what's a buffer? A buffer is just an amplification stage that in this case is taking your signal and controlling another signal with your signal, just the juice from the pedal. And it is actually amplifying it just to the same amount as your guitar, about the same volume as your guitar is sending. So your guitar signal is opening and closing some transistor or some other mechanism for allowing the juice from the pedal to flow through to the guitar. And what that does is it buffers the signal from your guitar from anything after that buffer. So it's essentially like all the interaction is between your guitar and that buffer pedal. If you put the volume before the pedal board, it will do exactly the same thing as turning the volume down in your guitar, but putting it after any buffer, and that is any pedal that isn't true bypass that has a buffer when it's off, or any gain pedal that's on, is essentially the same thing. A gain pedal is an amplifier that introduces some distortion in some way. So you could also have a pedal on all the time, and that would do the same thing as having a buffer. Now you can buy a standalone buffer, but generally speaking, like on my board, you'll have one or two pedals that either have a buffer all the time, or like the Klon, have a switch to turn it on and off. And a buffer has a lot of other nice characteristics. It'll drive the signal through longer cables and all sorts of things and keep it kind of clean by the time it hits the amplifier. So that's why buffers can be good. Now they can be bad. I have my fuzz in front of the Klon pedal because this fuzz, this is the Jimi Hendrix fuzz that is switchable between germanium and silicon, which is pretty cool to have such a tiny pedal that can do two different fuzzes essentially. The germanium doesn't like a buffer in front of it. It wants to see the signal that like a guitar has in front of it. And that can be true with other pedals as well, but generally speaking, it's mostly germanium boosts or fuzzes that have that characteristic. All right, so let's hear what that sounds like. So I'm going to just I'm going to leave all the pedals off. I'm going to show you that essentially you get the same EQ and sound, apart from any overdrive you might be getting will go away from the amp as you pull this pedal back. So here. Now that's about where I like it. I like it around 90 decibels. It's a little louder than talking. It's going to be loud enough you're not really going to be hearing the strings of your guitar too much, but it's not so loud it's going to bug neighbors in an apartment during the day. At nighttime, you might have to go a little further back. So let's dial back a little bit. So 85, I can talk over that just slightly louder than usual. It's basically a phone conversation. And at this, I can comfortably talk over it. Around 80. And I'm hearing my strings a lot more in the room. I'll see if I can get the room mic or my vocal mic to show that. And quieter than that, my strings start becoming louder than the guitar amplifier. And at that point, you're probably pretty comfortable. If nobody's bothered by your playing the guitar unplugged, they're not going to be bothered by that sound. And I'll run through that again just now, and in post I'll level the volumes out so you can hear that the EQ is roughly the same no matter where we're at there. So at this point, you're just going to have to, because I've leveled the volume, I'll be leveling out the volumes. You'll have to look at that decibel meter to understand what volume we're at. You can see as I'm talking, it's going between kind of 50 and 75. So that's normal speaking voice. And I'm about the same distance as the amplifier is from the decibel meter as my voice is, more or less. All right. So the other thing I've got going on that you probably noticed is I have a lot of amp in a box pedals here. And that's because when you're playing at these lower volumes, you're not going to be driving the amplifier. You're not going to be getting that nice tube distortion you get from the amplifier. Now, some people never do that anyways. They like to have a clean pedal platform and get all their gain from pedals. That's great. You'll be perfectly set up for here. But in my case, I've got both the Formula 55 and the Dirty Little Secret from Catalan Bread, which are a Fender Tweed and a Marshall JCM 800 kind of simulation pedal. The reason I picked them is that the Catalan Bread pedals are designed for this sort of black panel Fender style amplifier, a Deluxe Reverb in particular. A lot of pedals will either be designed for a Deluxe Reverb or a Hot Rod Deluxe, so you just want to kind of pick the kind that's probably designed for your amplifier. And that gives me some gain and some amp-like gain that I can drive with, say, the Klon or a fuzz to get the sounds I want at lower volumes. So let's check that out. So I'm going to bring the volume back up to around 80 or 90 here. And there's that nice reverb from the Deluxe Reverb. That is why everybody likes these amps. All right, so now let's do that same thing, but I'm going to step on the Formula 55. And you'll notice on both the Formula 55 and the Dirty Little Secret something I also like, which is they both have master volume knobs, which will do essentially the same thing as this Dunlop volume pedal, but they only work when they're on. So I like to have the volume pedal there to affect all the pedals the same way. And you can use the volume pedal, like say if I hit a boost into one of these and the volume goes up, I can dial back the volume pedal a little further and still be playing at practice volumes. So let's see what this sounds like. And go over to the Dirty Little Secret. Throw some delay on that. And you can even boost that with like the Klon, and you'll get the Marshall Klon into a Marshall sound. And back to clean again. And as you can see, you can kind of get a bunch of cool different sounds that way. Plenty to practice with. You can play around with your pedal board, all that stuff, even late at night. In fact, right now I'm shooting this video while my kids are getting ready for bed with no worries about interrupting that process. And I can dial it back a little further once they're actually asleep and keep practicing into the night. All right, well, hopefully that's useful to some of you. If you have any tips and tricks about how you practice at home with an amp like this, or what approaches you take, I know a lot of people will use a little practice amp or a modeling amp, which I generally don't like that much. The feel isn't right for me, and a lot of the reasonably priced practice/modeling amps have crappy speakers, all sorts of stuff in it. And this is, the sound I'm used to from playing loud. And if you're going to play live, it's great to kind of get a sense for what your amp will sound like with your board. So anyways, like I said, leave a comment if you've got any. Leave a question if you have any. I'm interested to hear how you all have been getting through quarantine life these past months, playing at volumes at home when you can't play out. Thanks, everyone. Bye.